Hello, this is video part 5, I believe. So I once read a book. It was called Metaphors We Live By. It was written by two cognitive psychologists. One specialized in linguistics, and the other, I believe, was a philosopher. Their names are Lakoff and Johnson. And I read this about 20 years ago during graduate studies. I think it was about 20 years ago, maybe 20 to 25 years ago. And it was, again, it's titled Metaphors We Live By. I can't recommend it. I don't consider these two, the authors, to be writers, and so I found the writing to be non-engaging. But the ideas were interesting for me. And the basic premise of the book is that there are these cultural scripts or cultural, maybe not even cultural. Maybe it was maybe it was more what would be the word? Anthropological, psychological. Uh, that there are these metaphors that operate underneath our notice, that control or shape and influence our thinking, and we may not even be aware of it. I don't remember all the metaphors that they mention, but for example, I remember they talked about, I forgot the name that they gave to it, but they talked about the metaphor of this notion of up and down, that at least in Western culture, up is associated with good and positive, and down is associated with negative. For example, heaven is usually thought of as up, hell is thought of as down. I feel up is a positive state, I feel down is a negative state. And that needn't be that way, and yet that metaphor, the analogy, I think it's a metaphor of this directionality, uh, is operating underneath our notice. And it can even influence our biases, such as looking upon taller persons, since they're up, as somehow more positive than shorter people. And by the way, this is a side comment, but it's interesting that in a number of Eastern medical systems, that directionality is reversed. So, for example, when energy rises, it's usually a sign of illness. And in fact, health is often denoted as having a head that's cool in temperature, and having warm feet. Illness would be described as having a head that's warm or heated and cold feet. That energy should not rise in the body, so lowering energy. In fact, a lot of meditation methods that are somehow tied to healing, which I would say in many ways, most meditation methods, one could say the physiological goal in some ways, if there is one, would be to cool the head and warm the feet, or warm the lower body. Qigong also is to settle the mind and bring the qi down into the feet and into the earth. So we have these metaphors that are operating underneath our notice, and they can shape our thinking. And another one of the metaphors that they talked about, I believe they referred to as the container metaphor. That we have these containers, like if you think of a jar, a sealed jar, it's a container. And whenever we have a container, there's an inside and an outside. So this idea of inside and outside tends to filter the way in which we think. For example, we can be amongst a group of friends or a group, and we can think there are the people who are inside the group, and there are people who are outside of that group. And we might have different feelings. In that case, the inside is preferable, and being on the outside is not. Anyway, so I wanted to stay a little bit with this container metaphor. Now, I think maybe some of you can guess where I'm going with this. It's a metaphor. It's what I would call an intellectual construct. But it needn't. So, for example, in the example I gave of like 5 people who might belong, let's say there are 5 friends and they decide to start a ramen club. So that they now are members of a ramen club, and they decide not to let anyone in. So now there's a exclusivity, sense of exclusivity, and they're the 5 members who are in the group, and everyone else is outside of the group. So all this is an intellectual construct. It's not the reality. The reality is these 5 people occasionally get together and eat ramen together. But each of these 5 people likely has other friends, and they hang out with other friends. So the ramen, belonging to this ramen club is a semi-arbitrary construct, an idea, but it doesn't describe anything unique about these 5 people. Other people eat ramen, and other people eat ramen with certain other people. Right? Maybe that's not the clearest example, but now there's an inside-outside construct or intellectual imposition that's often occurring for most of us human beings when we think of ourselves. We think of ourselves, and I'm just going to use the skin as the marker of the container. So we think of there's a skin that wraps around the body, and we think there's something on the inside which we refer to as self, or in my case, Yuichi, or I, myself, whatever. I'm just going to say self. And then there's everything outside of the skin. So there's the air, there's the sun, but in particular, there are other human beings and suppose other animals, but I'm just going to focus on the human beings. So the skin creates a container where there's an inside, self, and there's an outside, which is others. But this container metaphor that's operating underneath is, again, an intellectual construct. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Now, I'm going to invoke something that some of you may be familiar with and others you may not. And I'm just going to use this, not because I have any particular affinity for it. In fact, I don't. In fact, I think it's one of the worst things ever, or to me, it's one of the most baseless things written. But it's something that's called the Serenity Prayer. And it goes like this. You could Google that if you're not familiar with it, but it goes something like, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so what this prayer sets up is a dichotomy. Those things that we can change and those things we cannot. In some ways, one could rephrase that as those things we have some control over and those things that we do not. And if you go around interviewing people or who are familiar with this, especially people who might believe in it or use it, and you ask them what belongs in the category of things that you have some say over, that you have some control over, that you can change, and what belongs in the other category, I think most people will say the things that belong in the category of things that I can change, that I have some control over, influence over, is what's inside of me. Me, they'll say. Self. And what belongs in the category of things they cannot change is others. Now, this last comment, others can't be changed or others can't be controlled, sort of falls in line with, I believe, the last video I shot on control. And we can include not just control, but influencing and changing, right? And I argued that this attitude of I cannot change others or I cannot control others can be taken as a teaching, as a prescriptive sort of attitude to take if we want to be at peace. And so I'm not disagreeing with that categorization of putting others into that bin of things we cannot change. I argued that objectively we can change people, but to attempt to change them or to carry the belief that we can sometimes take away from some of our own happiness or peace. What I will argue against is the first categorization, where some people believe, I know a decent number of people who believe that what belongs in the category of things that they can change is self. And I would say, actually, that's incorrect. And it's incorrect in the same way that I argued that it's incorrect to think that it would be incorrect for someone like me to think that I can change others. Objectively, I said that one can, but if I take the attitude that I can change others, I run into trouble. But I would also argue that if I carry the belief that I can change myself, I will run into the almost exact same problems as believing that I can change others. Another way to say what I just said is to say that self-improvement doesn't work. Self-improvement is actually an impractical endeavor. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work. One cannot improve oneself. And so some people, religious people, say, well, it must require God then. And I would say, no, that's not actually the point. That self-improvement doesn't work because self-improvement is predicated upon the premise. Is that even a correct sentence? It rests on the premise that one can control or one can change oneself. And earlier in the last video, I made the comment that if we are living with a certain level of denial, we can become convinced that we can change others. But if we examine things carefully, we may come to see that in fact, it's a non-sustainable endeavor. Well, so I'll flip that back toward self, that the argument that I'll give, because we're almost at 12 minutes, I'm going to have to continue this in the next video, but the argument that I'll give is that many of us, I believe, live under some delusion or denial that we can actually change ourselves, that we can actually have some control over ourselves. And I would say, again, that's a delusion. There's a certain level of denial going on, and I believe it comes from not carefully enough examining what's really happening. And just like with trying to control or change others, it's an unsustainable endeavor. So in the short term, it may give off the impression, the appearance that something is happening. But just like with someone focused on others, if one focuses only on the short term, it looks like, yes, we can control others and we can control ourselves. But if we take a long-term view of it, we'll be able to see that in fact, it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. Just as we can't change others or control others, we can't change ourselves or control ourselves either. They don't work. They just both give off an impression of short-term efficacy. And we can easily become fooled or deluded into thinking that they're working, when in fact they don't. And I would say that the fault of this kind of thinking, believing that we can actually change ourselves, comes from this implicit metaphor, the container metaphor, that we have this artificial idea that there's an inside and an outside, that somehow laws or rules that apply out there, especially to other people, don't apply inwardly. But the only thing separating what's happening in here and what's happening out there is the skin. The skin should not, in other words, it's almost like there's a bunch of cosmic laws operating out there, and somehow what's going on inside is immune to those cosmic laws, universal laws. I would say that this idea that there's an inside and outside, again, is an intellectual construct. That ultimately, on an absolute level, there is no inside and outside. It's just an idea. That if we remove this idea, what we have is life. Life is happening out there, and life is happening in here. And the in here and out there is just a concept. And so there's just life happening everywhere. Life is again, life is happening out there, life is happening in here. But life is happening. What applies out there applies in here. Hopefully that makes sense. It should make sense, right? That what's happening in here and what's happening out there are one and the same. So what applies out there applies in here. What applies in here applies out there. So if I can control myself, or I can change myself, I can change others. Yeah? And just as likely, if I want to maintain peace and take on this prescriptive view that I can't change others, then I have to take on the same view that I can't change self. Yeah? This is now 15 minutes, so I'm gonna end this video right here.